some secrets are buried for a reason. In the dense forests of northern Montana, where the morning mist clings to ancient pine trees and the silence can swallow a scream whole, experienced hunter Jake Morrison thought he had seen everything the wilderness could offer. After 30 years of tracking deer, elk, and bear through these woods, he believed nothing could surprise him anymore. He was wrong. What started as a routine hunting expedition on a crisp October morning would become the most terrifying discovery of his life. Hidden beneath years of carefully arranged debris, concealed from prying eyes and protected by desperate lies, lay a truth so shocking that it would shake an entire community to its core. The woman's desperate plea echoed through the forest. "Stop! Don't look under there!" But some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Some secrets demand to be revealed, no matter how much pain they might cause. This is the true story of what Jake Morrison found that day, and how one moment of curiosity changed everything for everyone involved. It's a story about the lengths people will go to protect their darkest secrets, and what happens when those secrets finally come to light. The truth was waiting there, just beneath the surface, ready to destroy lives and reveal the shocking reality of what had been hidden for so long. Jake Morrison stepped carefully through the undergrowth, his weathered boots making soft crunching sounds on the carpet of fallen leaves. The October air was sharp and clean, carrying the earthy scent of decomposing foliage and the distant promise of snow. At 52 years old, Jake had been hunting these Montana forests since he was barely tall enough to carry a rifle properly. Every tree, every stream, every hidden valley was as familiar to him as the rooms of his own house. But today felt different. Today, something was pulling him deeper into the woods than he usually ventured, toward a section of forest he rarely visited. It wasn't prime hunting territory, too dense, too remote, and frankly, too eerie for his liking. The trees grew closer together here, their branches intertwining overhead to create a natural canopy that blocked out most of the morning sunlight. Even the wildlife seemed to avoid this area. In all his years of hunting, Jake had never seen so much as a deer track in this particular stretch of wilderness. He paused beside a massive Douglas fir, checking his compass and taking a swig from his water bottle. His original plan had been to set up near Miller's Creek, about 2 miles back, where he'd had good luck with white-tailed deer in previous seasons. But something had drawn him away from his intended path. Some inexplicable urge to explore this forgotten corner of the forest. Maybe it was the strange conversation he'd had with old Pete Hendricks at the gas station 3 days earlier. Pete had been acting nervous, shifty-eyed, when Jake mentioned his hunting plans. When Jake had casually mentioned he might venture into the deep woods this time, Pete had actually grabbed his arm. "Stay away from the old logging area," Pete had whispered urgently. "Nothing good ever comes from poking around up there." Jake had laughed it off at the time. Pete was known around town for his tall tales and conspiracy theories. The old man saw mystery and danger in everything from the weather patterns to the way the grocery store arranged its produce. But now, standing in the hushed silence of the deep forest, Jake found himself thinking about Pete's warning. The old logging area. Jake knew about it, of course. Back in the 1980s, there had been a small logging operation in this part of the forest. Nothing major, just a family business that had cut timber for local construction projects. The operation had shut down suddenly in 1987, and the family had packed up and moved away without much explanation. The official story was financial troubles, but small towns like theirs were breeding grounds for speculation and rumor. Jake adjusted his rifle strap and continued walking. The silence was becoming oppressive now, broken only by the sound of his own footsteps and breathing. No birds sang in these trees. No squirrels chattered from the branches. Even the wind seemed muted here, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. As he walked, Jake began to notice signs of the old logging operation. Rusted pieces of machinery peeked through the undergrowth like metal bones. A length of chain, orange with rust, was wrapped around the trunk of a pine tree that had grown thick enough to swallow the links. There were old tire tracks too, barely visible now but still discernible to someone who knew how to read the forest's subtle signs. The path, such as it was, led him deeper into a natural clearing where the logging company had obviously done most of their work. Stumps dotted the area like tombstones, some of them nearly 40 years old and partially decomposed. Nature was slowly reclaiming this place, covering the scars left by human industry with new growth and wild vegetation. But there was something else here too. Something that made the hair on the back of Jake's neck stand up. Near the far edge of the clearing, partially hidden by a thick stand of young aspens, was what looked like a small cabin or shelter. It was crudely built, more like a hunting blind than a proper structure, constructed from weathered plywood and corrugated metal. Whoever had built it had tried to camouflage it, covering much of the roof with branches and dead vegetation. Jake approached the structure cautiously. Something about it felt wrong, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what. Maybe it was the way it seemed to crouch in the shadows, deliberately hidden from view. Or maybe it was the smell that grew stronger as he got closer. A musty, unpleasant odor that reminded him of old basements and forgotten storage rooms. As he got within 20 feet of the structure, Jake heard something that made his blood run cold. Voices. Low, urgent voices coming from inside the hidden shelter. He froze, his hand instinctively moving to his rifle. Who would be out here this deep in the wilderness in such a remote and forgotten place? Hunters didn't come here. Hikers avoided this area. Even the local teenagers, always looking for secluded spots to drink and cause trouble, stayed away from the old logging area. Jake crept closer, moving as quietly as he could through the undergrowth. The voices became clearer as he approached, and he could make out at least two distinct speakers, one male, one female. They seemed to be arguing about something, though their words were still too muffled for him to understand. When he was close enough to touch the rough plywood wall, Jake carefully positioned himself near what appeared to be a small window. The glass was dirty and covered with years of grime, but through a clear spot near the corner, he could see inside. What he saw made his stomach drop. The interior of the shelter was lit by several battery-powered lanterns, casting harsh shadows on the walls. There were two people inside, a man in his 40s with graying hair and worn clothing, and a woman about the same age, thin and nervous-looking. But it wasn't the people themselves that shocked Jake. It was what they were doing. The floor of the shelter was covered with tarps, and on those tarps were dozens of cardboard boxes, plastic containers, and what looked like evidence bags. The man was holding a clipboard, checking items off a list, while the woman carefully packed something into a large duffel bag. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what Jake could see scattered on a table near the window. Photographs. Hundreds of photographs, many of them appearing to show the same location at different times. And jewelry. Lots of jewelry. Rings, necklaces, bracelets, watches, all of it arranged in neat rows like a jeweler's display case. Jake's mind raced. This wasn't some innocent hunting shelter or temporary campsite. This was something else entirely. Something that made his skin crawl and his hands shake. He was trying to back away quietly when his foot caught on a fallen branch. The dry wood snapped, with a sound that seemed to echo through the forest like a gunshot. The voices inside the shelter stopped immediately. Jake held his breath, pressing himself against the wall, and hoping they hadn't heard him. For a long moment, there was complete silence. Then he heard the woman's voice, high and panicked. "Did you hear that? Someone's out there. Calm down," the man replied. But Jake could hear the tension in his voice too. It was probably just an animal. No, it wasn't an animal. Someone's watching us. I can feel it. Jake heard footsteps inside the shelter, moving toward the door. He had to make a decision quickly. He could try to run, but in this dense undergrowth, he'd never be able to move quietly enough to avoid detection. Or he could confront them directly, but he had no idea who these people were or what they might be capable of. The decision was made for him when the shelter's door suddenly swung open. The man stepped out first, and Jake got his first clear look at him. He was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that came from spending a lot of time outdoors. But his eyes were what struck Jake most. They were cold and calculating, the eyes of someone who had seen things and done things that most people couldn't imagine. Behind him came the woman, and she was clearly terrified. Her hands were shaking, and she kept looking around as if expecting danger to emerge from every shadow. "Hello," Jake called out, trying to keep his voice steady and casual. "I didn't mean to startle you folks. Just out hunting and got a little turned around." The man's eyes narrowed as he studied Jake, taking in the hunting rifle, the camouflage clothing, the general appearance of legitimacy. But Jake could see that he wasn't buying the innocent hunter story. "This is private property," the man said slowly. "You shouldn't be here." Jake looked around at the forest surrounding them. "Private property? I don't see any signs. And I've been hunting these woods for 30 years. Never heard of any private land out this way." "Well, now you have," the woman said, her voice sharp with fear and anger. "So why don't you just turn around and go back where you came from?" But Jake's curiosity was fully aroused now. Something was very wrong here, and every instinct he developed over decades of outdoor experience was screaming at him to find out what it was. "What's in the shelter?" he asked directly. The woman took a step backward, her face going pale. "Nothing. Just camping supplies." "Camping supplies?" Jake repeated. "All the way out here, in October? Without a vehicle?"
The man and woman exchanged a look, and Jake saw something pass between them. A kind of silent communication that spoke of shared secrets and mutual dependence.
"Look, friend," the man said, his voice taking on a more threatening tone.
You seem like a reasonable guy. Why don't we all just pretend this meeting never happened? You go your way, we'll go ours, and everybody stays happy. But Jake was beyond the point of walking away now. Something about this whole situation was setting off alarm bells in his head. The remote location, the hidden shelter, the obvious attempts to conceal their activities, none of it added up to anything innocent. I think I'd like to see what's in those boxes, Jake said, adjusting his grip on his rifle. The woman let out a small, frightened cry. No, you can't. You don't understand what you're getting involved in. Then explain it to me, Jake said firmly. Make me understand. The man was studying Jake carefully now, as if trying to decide whether he represented a threat that needed to be eliminated or a problem that could be managed in some other way. You really want to know? The man asked finally. I really want to know. The man nodded slowly, as if he'd come to some kind of internal decision. All right then, but once I tell you, there's no going back. Once you know what we know, you're part of this whether you want to be or not. Jake felt a chill run down his spine, but he nodded. I understand. The man gestured towards the shelter. Then come inside. But I'm warning you, what you're about to see is going to change everything you thought you knew about this place. And about some people in our town. As Jake followed them toward the shelter door, the woman grabbed his arm. Her fingers were ice cold, and her grip was surprisingly strong. Please, she whispered urgently. Stop. Don't look under there. Some things are better left buried. But Jake had come too far to turn back now. Whatever secrets this hidden shelter contained, whatever truths these two people were so desperate to protect, he was going to uncover them. He had no idea that in the next few minutes he would discover something so shocking, so unthinkable, that it would haunt him for the rest of his life. Something that would force him to question everything he thought he knew about his quiet little town and the people who lived there. The door to the shelter stood open before him, and beyond it lay answers to questions he hadn't even known he should be asking. Jake stepped across the threshold of the shelter, and immediately the musty smell he'd noticed earlier became overwhelming. It was the smell of old paper and fabric, of things that had been stored too long in damp conditions. But underneath that was something else, something that made his stomach turn, a faint but unmistakable odor of decay. The interior of the shelter was larger than it had appeared from outside. The walls were lined with shelves and tables, all of them covered with the items he'd glimpsed through the window. But now, in the harsh light of the battery-powered lanterns, he could see everything clearly, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The photographs were everywhere, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, arranged in neat stacks and rows. Some were recent color prints, others were older black and white images that looked like they dated back decades. Jake picked up one of the stacks and began flipping through them, his hands trembling slightly. The first few photos seemed innocent enough, shots of the forest, the old logging area, various buildings around town. But as he continued looking, the images became more disturbing. Pictures of people, taken from a distance with telephoto lenses. People who were obviously unaware they were being photographed. People in their homes, in their cars, walking down streets, sitting in restaurants. Surveillance photos, Jake said quietly. The man nodded grimly, among other things. Jake set down the stack of photos and moved to the table where the jewelry was displayed. Up close, he could see that each piece was carefully tagged with what looked like dates and locations. A gold wedding ring tagged Miller Residence, March 15, 1998. A silver necklace marked Johnson Property, July 4, 2001. A man's watch labeled Thompson House, December 23, 2005. The dates went back 20 years or more, and Jake recognized many of the family names. These were people from his town, his neighbors and friends, people he'd known for decades. Where did all this come from? He asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. The woman had been watching him carefully, and now she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. It came from the graves. Jake felt the world shift beneath his feet. What graves? The man walked to one of the cardboard boxes and opened it, revealing more photographs and what looked like official documents. There are 43 graves out there, he said, gesturing vaguely toward the forest beyond the shelter. 43 people who disappeared over the past 25 years. People who were supposedly killed in accidents, or who moved away suddenly, or who just vanished without a trace.
"That's impossible," Jake said. But even as he spoke the words, he was remembering things.
People who had indeed disappeared over the years. Mrs. Patterson, who had supposedly moved to Florida to live with her sister, but who had never been heard from again. The Kowalski family, who had allegedly died in a car accident while traveling cross-country, though their bodies had never been found. Young Tommy Hayes, who had supposedly run away to join the military, but who had never contacted his family again. "Show him," the woman said quietly. "Show him the list." The man pulled out a typewritten document, yellowed with age. At the top, in neat block letters, were the words, Forest Project, Phase 1. Below that was a list of names, dates, and brief descriptions. Jake read the first few entries, his horror growing with each line. Patterson, Margaret, February 12, 1990, natural causes. Cover story, buried sector, 7.
Hayes, Thomas, August 5th, 2003. Runaway cover story. Buried sector 12. Kowalski family. 4 members. October 18th, 2000.
Buried sector 15. The list went on, documenting what appeared to be a systematic program of murder that had been carried out in their small town for more than 2 decades. "Who did this?" Jake asked, his voice barely functioning. The man and woman exchanged another look, and Jake saw fear in both their faces. "We did," the woman said finally. "We were part of it. We helped make people disappear." Jake staggered backward, his rifle clattering to the floor. "You're murderers?" "No," the man said quickly. "We never killed anyone, but we helped cover it up. We helped dispose of the evidence. We helped maintain the lies." "Why?" Jake demanded. "Why would you do such a thing?" The woman began to cry, silent tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Because we were told it was necessary. Because we were told it was for the greater good. Because we were told that if we didn't help, we'd be next." Jake's mind was reeling. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening in his quiet little town, among people he'd known his entire life. "Who told you? Who was giving the orders?" The man hesitated, and Jake could see him wrestling with some internal debate. Finally, he walked to another box and pulled out a different set of documents. These appeared to be official correspondence. Letters and memos, typed on letterhead. Jake recognized the letterhead immediately. It was from the town council. "It started small," the man explained. "Back in 1987, when the logging operation shut down, there had been an accident, they said. A worker had been killed and it needed to be covered up to protect the town from lawsuits and negative publicity." "What kind of accident?" "The kind that wasn't an accident," the woman said bitterly. "The kind where someone asked too many questions about where certain materials were being stored. The kind where someone threatened to go to the authorities about toxic waste being dumped in the forest." Jake felt sick. The logging operation was a cover for illegal dumping? "Among other things," the man confirmed. "But when that first person disappeared, when that first cover story was created and accepted by everyone in town, certain people realized they had discovered something very useful. A way to make problems disappear," Jake said, understanding dawning. "Exactly. Over the years, whenever someone became inconvenient, whether they knew too much or asked too many questions or threatened to expose corruption or simply had something that someone else wanted, they would disappear. And there was always a plausible cover story, always a reasonable explanation that everyone accepted without question." Jake looked around the shelter again, seeing it now with new understanding. This wasn't just a storage facility for stolen goods. This was a record-keeping operation, a careful documentation of a quarter-century of systematic murder and cover-up. "How many people are involved?" he asked. "We don't know everyone," the woman admitted. "We were just small cogs in a big machine. We were told what to do, and we did it. We picked up personal effects from the victims' homes after the disappearances. We doctored photographs and documents to support the cover stories. We spread rumors and gossip to make the official explanations seem more believable. But you must know who was giving you orders." The man nodded reluctantly. "We reported to one person. Someone who has been coordinating all of this from the beginning." "Who?" "Mayor Caldwell." Jake's legs nearly gave out. Richard Caldwell had been mayor of their town for over 15 years. He was a pillar of the community, a family man, a regular at church. Jake had voted for him in every election. "That's impossible," Jake said weakly. "Is it?" the woman asked. "Think about it. Who would have the authority to cover up accidents and deaths? Who would have access to official records and documents? Who would be able to coordinate between the police, the coroner's office, and the various other agencies that would need to be involved in creating and maintaining these cover stories. Jake's mind was racing, fitting pieces together like a horrible jigsaw puzzle. Over the years, there had been things that seemed odd in retrospect. Police investigations that were concluded unusually quickly. Coroner's reports that seemed vague and inconclusive. Families who accepted tragic news with what seemed like unusual calm, as if they'd been prepared for it somehow. The families, Jake said suddenly. The families of the victims. Do they know? Dare! Some of them, the man admitted. The ones who ask too many questions or refuse to accept the official stories, they get visits from concerned citizens who explain the situation to them. They're told that their loved ones are actually still alive, but that they have to remain hidden for their own safety. They're told that if they cooperate and keep quiet, they might see them again someday. And they believe that. Desperate people will believe almost anything if it gives them hope, the woman said sadly. And the alternative, accepting that their family members were murdered and that the entire community is involved in covering it up, is too horrible for most people to accept. Jake walked to the shelter's small window and looked out at the forest beyond. Somewhere out there, according to these people, were 43 graves containing the bodies of his neighbors and friends. People he'd known, people he'd cared about, people he'd mourned when they supposedly moved away or died in accidents. "Show me," he said quietly. "What?" Jake turned back to face them. "Show me the graves. I want to see them." The woman shook her head frantically. "We can't. We're not supposed to go out there. It's too dangerous." "Dangerous how?" "There are people watching," the man explained. "Security. People who make sure that nobody gets too close to the burial sites. People who deal with anyone who discovers what's really going on." "Like you?" Jake asked. They both nodded miserably. "So what happens now?" Jake asked. "What happens to me?" The man and woman looked at each other, and Jake saw something pass between them that chilled him to the bone. "We're supposed to call it in," the woman whispered. "We're supposed to report any unauthorized discoveries. And then someone comes to clean up the situation." "Clean up the situation," Jake repeated. "You mean kill me?" "We don't want to," the man said quickly. "That's why we were arguing when you arrived. We've been trying to figure out a way to handle this that doesn't result in anyone else getting hurt." Jake looked around the shelter one more time, taking in the overwhelming evidence of systematic murder and corruption. His entire worldview had been shattered in the space of half an hour. Everything he thought he knew about his community, about the people he'd lived among his entire life, had been revealed as a carefully constructed lie. "How long have you two been involved in this?" he asked. 15 years, the woman said. "Ever since my husband started asking questions about the toxic waste dumping. They made him disappear, and then they told me I could either help them or join him. I chose to stay alive," she said defensively. "I chose to keep my children alive. You don't understand what it's like to have everything you care about threatened by people who have already proven they're willing to kill." Jake understood more than she knew. He was beginning to realize that he was now in exactly the same position. He had discovered something that certain powerful people would kill to keep secret. His life, and possibly the lives of his family members, were now in danger. "There has to be a way out," he said. "There has to be a way to expose this without getting everyone killed." The man laughed bitterly. "Do you think we haven't thought of that? Do you think we haven't spent years trying to figure out how to escape this situation? The problem is that too many people are involved now. Too many people have too much to lose if the truth comes out. How many people are we talking about? The mayor, obviously. Most of the town council. The police chief and several officers. The coroner. The editor of the local newspaper. Several prominent businessmen. Maybe 50 or 60 people total, all told." Jake felt overwhelmed by the scope of the conspiracy. 50 or 60 people? How is it possible that so many people could be involved in something like this without anyone finding out? "Because most of them don't know the full scope of what's happening," the woman explained. "They just know their little piece of it. The police chief thinks he's covering up accidents and helping families deal with tragedy. The coroner thinks he's protecting the town from lawsuits and bad publicity. The newspaper editor thinks he's maintaining community morale by focusing on positive stories instead of dwelling on tragedies. And the people who do know the full truth, they're too deeply involved to back out now. They've all benefited from the system in one way or another, financially, politically, personally. They've all got blood on their hands, even if they never personally killed anyone." Jake was quiet for a long moment, trying to process everything he'd learned. Outside the shelter, the forest was completely silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Finally, he looked up at his two companions. "What were you two doing out here today?" The man gestured toward the boxes and documents scattered around the shelter. Maintenance? We come out here once a month to update the records, organize the evidence, make sure everything is properly preserved. Evidence of what?
Insurance, the woman said.
In case something goes wrong. In case someone decides we know too much and tries to eliminate us. All of this, she waved at the photographs and documents, is our life insurance policy. Jake nodded slowly. It made sense in a twisted way. These people were caught in an impossible situation, complicit in terrible crimes, but also potential victims themselves. They were documenting everything as a way of protecting themselves from the very people they were working for. Where are the burial sites? He asked. The man hesitated, then walked to a hand-drawn map tacked to one of the walls. It showed the forest area around them, with various sectors marked and numbered. They're scattered throughout about a 10-square-mile area, he explained, pointing to different locations on the map. Never more than 1 or 2 bodies in each location, always in places that are remote and difficult to access. Always carefully concealed and camouflaged. Jake studied the map, noting that several of the marked locations were areas where he'd hunted over the years. He could have walked within feet of some of these graves without ever knowing they were there. The most recent burial was 3 months ago, the woman said quietly. Sarah Mitchell. Sarah Mitchell was a young woman who had supposedly moved to California to pursue an acting career. She'd been saying goodbye to people around town for weeks before her departure, talking excitedly about her new opportunities and her bright future. Sarah Mitchell is dead? She found out about the toxic waste dumping, the man explained. She was working for the county environmental office, and she'd started investigating some soil samples that showed contamination in areas where there shouldn't have been any. She was asking too many questions, getting too close to the truth. So they killed her. And then they created the perfect cover story. Everyone in town knew she'd been talking about moving to California. It was easy to convince people that she'd finally gotten the opportunity she'd been waiting for. Jake felt sick. He'd known Sarah since she was a child. He'd watched her grow up, go to college, come back to work for the county. She'd been excited about her environmental work, passionate about protecting the natural areas around their town. And now she was dead, buried somewhere in these woods, another victim of the systematic corruption that had infected his community like a cancer. I have to do something, Jake said. I can't just walk away and pretend I never saw this. You don't have a choice, the woman said desperately. If you try to expose this, you'll just become another name on the list. Another tragic accident or sudden disappearance. Maybe, but I can't live knowing what I know and doing nothing about it. Jake walked to the shelter door and looked out at the forest. Somewhere out there were the bodies of 43 people, including a young woman he'd known since she was born. People who had trusted their community, trusted their leaders, trusted that justice and truth still mattered in their small corner of the world. They had been wrong, and now Jake had to decide what he was willing to risk to make sure their deaths hadn't been completely meaningless. Behind him, he heard the woman whispering urgently to her companion, "We have to call it in. We don't have a choice. If they find out we let him go without reporting it, we're dead." Jake turned around slowly. How long before they get here? 20 minutes, maybe 30, the man said reluctantly.
They have people stationed around the area. 20 minutes.
Jake looked around the shelter one more time, memorizing as much as he could.
In 20 minutes, this place would probably be cleaned out and destroyed. The evidence would disappear, and he would either be dead or so thoroughly intimidated that he'd never speak of what he'd discovered. Unless he could figure out a way to turn the situation to his advantage. I have a proposition for you, Jake said suddenly. Jake's mind was working furiously as he watched the man and woman exchange nervous glances. 20 minutes wasn't much time, but it might be enough if he played his cards right. What kind of proposition? The woman asked, though her voice suggested she was afraid to hear the answer. Jake picked up one of the stacks of photographs and held it up. You said this is your life insurance policy. Well, I think we can make it work for all of us. You don't understand the situation. These aren't people you can negotiate with. These aren't people who make deals. Maybe not, Jake agreed. But they are people who understand self-preservation. And right now, I represent a threat to their survival just as much as they represent a threat to mine. Jake walked to the table where the jewelry was displayed and picked up several pieces, examining the tags. All of this evidence, all of these records, this represents decades of work, decades of careful documentation. If something happened to it, if it somehow found its way into the wrong hands, it would be enough to destroy dozens of lives and bring down an entire power structure. That's exactly why we can't let you leave here alive, the woman said, her voice breaking. Don't you see? We're as trapped as you are now. But Jake was already moving, gathering up documents and photographs, stuffing them into his hunting pack. Help me load this stuff into my truck, he said. All of it. Every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence. What? The man said, confused. Why would we do that? Because in about 15 minutes, whoever you called is going to arrive here expecting to find a problem that needs to be eliminated. Instead, they're going to find an empty shelter and no evidence that any of this ever existed. The woman was staring at him as if he'd lost his mind. You want to steal the evidence? I want to preserve it, Jake corrected. And I want to make sure that everyone involved in this conspiracy understands that their secrets are no longer safe. Jake continued packing, moving quickly but carefully to preserve the organization of the documents. Here's what's going to happen. We're going to take all of this evidence to a secure location. Then we're going to make contact with federal authorities, FBI, maybe the state attorney general's office, people who aren't part of the local power structure. They'll kill us before we can do any of that, the man protested. Not if we're smart about it. Not if we make sure they understand that killing us would only make their situation worse. Jake finished loading his pack and started on a second bag. You said there are people watching the area. Where are they positioned? The man hesitated, then walked to the window and pointed towards several locations around the clearing. There are usually 2 or 3 people out there during our maintenance visits. They stay far enough back that we can't see them, but close enough to respond if there's trouble. And they communicate by radio. Cell phone, usually. Jake nodded. Good. That means their response time isn't immediate. We'll have a few minutes head start. The woman was watching him work, her expression shifting from fear to something like hope. You really think we can expose all of this? You really think we can stop them?
I think we can try, Jake said.
And I think the alternative, letting this continue indefinitely, is unacceptable. As he packed, Jake's mind was working through the logistics of what he was proposing. They would need to get the evidence to a secure location, probably somewhere outside the local area, where it couldn't be easily retrieved or destroyed. They would need to make contact with law enforcement agencies that weren't compromised by the local conspiracy, and they would need to do it all while staying alive long enough to see justice done. It wasn't going to be easy. But looking around the shelter at the overwhelming evidence of systematic murder and corruption, Jake knew that he couldn't walk away and pretend he'd never seen it. There's something else you need to know, the woman said suddenly. About the burial sites. About what's really buried out there. Jake paused in his packing. What do you mean? The man looked uncomfortable, but the woman pressed on. The bodies aren't the only things buried in those graves. There are other things too. Documents, computer hard drives, financial records, evidence of other crimes that go way beyond just murder. What kind of other crimes? Embezzlement? Money laundering, tax evasion, bribery. This whole thing started as a way to cover up environmental crimes, but over the years it expanded into a way to hide all kinds of illegal activities. Jake felt his understanding of the situation shift again. So we're not just talking about a conspiracy to commit murder. We're talking about a comprehensive criminal enterprise that has been operating for decades.
Exactly.
And the financial stakes are enormous. We're talking about millions of dollars that have been stolen or hidden over the years. That explained a lot, Jake realized. It explained how the conspiracy could involve so many people and remain hidden for so long. It wasn't just about covering up accidents or eliminating inconvenient individuals. It was about protecting a massive financial empire built on corruption and crime. How much time do we have left? Jake asked, looking at his watch. The man checked his cell phone. Maybe 10 minutes before they start wondering why we haven't checked in. Jake made a decision. We're leaving now. Help me carry this stuff to my truck. For a moment, the man and woman just stood there, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. Then the woman picked up one of the boxes of documents. Sarah Mitchell was my niece, she said quietly. I held her when she was born. I watched her take her first steps. I helped her with her homework when she was in elementary school. The man looked at her in surprise. You never told me that. I never told anyone. When she started asking questions about the environmental contamination, I tried to warn her. I tried to get her to drop the investigation. But she was so passionate about protecting the environment, so determined to do the right thing. Tears were streaming down the woman's face now. When they told me she had to disappear, when they told me she was going to be another tragic accident, I tried to protest. I tried to find another way. What happened? Jake asked gently. They reminded me that I had children of my own. They reminded me that accidents can happen to anyone at any time. Jake felt a surge of anger that was almost overwhelming. These people weren't just murderers, they were terrorists, using fear and intimidation to maintain control over an entire community. Help me get this evidence out of here, Jake said firmly. Help me make sure that Sarah's death and all the others actually mean something. The three of them worked quickly, carrying boxes and bags of evidence out of the shelter and loading them into Jake's pickup truck. The forest around them remained eerily silent, but Jake could feel eyes watching them from the shadows. When they had loaded the last of the evidence, Jake turned to his two companions. What are your names? Your real names? I'm Carol Patterson, the woman said. Margaret Patterson was my sister-in-law. And I'm David Kowalski, the man added. The Kowalski family that supposedly died in the car accident. Those were my cousins. Jake nodded grimly. Now he understood why these two had been chosen to help maintain the evidence. The conspiracy's leaders had deliberately selected people who had personal stakes in keeping the secrets buried, and people who could be controlled through grief and fear. Well, Carol and David, Jake said, we're about to find out if justice still exists in this world. They climbed into Jake's truck and he started the engine. As they drove away from the clearing, Jake could see movement in his rearview mirror, dark figures emerging from the forest, converging on the abandoned shelter. They'll know we took everything, Carol said nervously. Good, Jake replied. I want them to know. I want them to understand that their secrets are no longer safe. As they drove through the forest on the old logging road, Jake's cell phone began to ring. He looked at the caller ID and wasn't surprised to see that it was Mayor Caldwell. Don't answer it, David warned, but Jake had a different idea. He handed the phone to Carol. You answer it, tell them exactly what they expect to hear. Carol looked confused, but she took the phone. Hello? Jake could hear Mayor Caldwell's voice on the other end, though he couldn't make out the words. Everything is fine, Mr. Feed. Mayor, Carol said, following Jake's lead. We're just finishing up the maintenance work now. Yes, we had a small situation, but it's been handled. The hunter has been dealt with. Jake nodded approvingly. Let them think everything was proceeding according to plan. Let them think they still had control of the situation. Carol ended the call and handed the phone back to Jake. He wants us to report to his office tomorrow morning for debriefing. Perfect, Jake said. That gives us about 18 hours to get this evidence into the right hands. As they reached the main road, Jake made another decision. Instead of heading toward town, he turned in the opposite direction, toward the state highway that would take them away from the immediate danger zone. Where are we going? David asked. First, we're going to find a secure location to store this evidence, somewhere that isn't controlled by anyone involved in the conspiracy. Then, we're going to make some phone calls. Jake had been thinking about this during the drive. His brother-in-law was a retired FBI agent who now worked as a private investigator in the state capitol. If anyone would know how to handle a situation like this, it would be Mike. But first, they needed to ensure that the evidence was safe. Jake knew of an old storage facility about 50 miles away, run by a friend of his who would ask no questions and provide secure, climate-controlled storage. As they drove, Carol and David began to open up about their experiences over the past 15 years. They told Jake about the gradual escalation of the conspiracy, how it had started with small favors and minor cover-ups, and evolved into a comprehensive criminal enterprise. They told him about the victims they'd known personally, the families they'd watched suffer, the lies they'd been forced to tell and retell until they'd almost believed them themselves. The worst part, David said, was watching the families. Watching them grieve for people who they thought had moved away or died accidentally when we knew the truth. Watching them hope for letters or phone calls that would never come. Some of the families figured it out eventually, Carol added. They started asking too many questions, pushing too hard for answers. And then they would either disappear themselves, or they would suddenly become very quiet and cooperative. Jake felt sick thinking about the scope of the conspiracy. How many families do you think know the truth? Maybe a dozen, Carol estimated. Families who were given the choice between silence and joining their missing relatives. It was almost too much to comprehend. Jake had lived in this community his entire life, had considered it a safe and normal place where people looked out for each other, and justice prevailed. Now he was learning that it was actually a carefully maintained facade, hiding a network of corruption and murder that extended back decades. When they reached the storage facility, Jake rented a climate-controlled unit under a false name, paying cash and avoiding any paperwork that could be traced back to him. They spent 2 hours carefully organizing and cataloging the evidence, taking photographs of everything with Jake's digital camera to create backup records. The sheer volume of material was staggering. Financial records showing embezzlement and money laundering operations totaling millions of dollars. Correspondence between conspiracy members discussing the elimination of specific individuals. Detailed maps showing the locations of burial sites. Medical records that had been falsified to support cover stories about accidental deaths. "This is enough to bring down the entire power structure of our town," Jake said, as he surveyed the organized evidence. "If we can get it to the right people," David reminded him. "And if we can stay alive long enough to see it through." Jake looked at his watch. It was now late afternoon, and they had been missing from town for several hours. By now, the cleanup crew would have discovered that the shelter was empty and that the evidence was gone. Mayor Caldwell and his co-conspirators would be frantically trying to figure out what had happened and how to contain the situation. "We need to make our move soon," Jake said. "Once they realize we have the evidence, they're going to do everything they can to stop us." Jake called his brother-in-law Mike from a payphone at a gas station, explaining the situation in general terms and asking for advice on how to proceed. Mike immediately understood the gravity of the situation and arranged to meet them at a neutral location, a truck stop halfway between their current position and the state capitol. As they drove toward the meeting point, Carol and David seemed to grow more nervous. "What if this doesn't work?" Carol asked. "What if the federal authorities don't believe us? What if the conspiracy reaches further than we think?" "Then we'll have tried," Jake said simply, "and that's more than anyone else has been able to do." But privately, Jake was asking himself the same questions. The conspiracy they'd uncovered was so extensive, so well organized, that it seemed almost impossible that it could be limited to just one small town. How many other communities had similar networks of corruption operating beneath the surface? How many other people had discovered the truth and been silenced before they could act on it? They met Mike at the truck stop as planned, and Jake spent 3 hours briefing his brother-in-law on everything they'd discovered. Mike, a veteran investigator with 25 years of federal law enforcement experience, listened carefully and asked detailed questions about the evidence and the people involved. "This is bigger than anything I've ever seen," Mike said finally. "The level of organization, the duration of the criminal activity, the number of people involved. This is going to require a major federal task force to investigate properly."
"Can you make that happen?" Jake asked.
"I can make some calls. I have contacts in the FBI and the State Attorney General's office who specialize in public corruption cases. But you need to understand that once we start this ball rolling, there's no going back. Your lives are going to change forever." Jake looked at Carol and David, who nodded grimly. "Our lives changed forever the moment we became involved in this conspiracy," Carol said. "Now we have a chance to change them back." Mike made several phone calls, and within hours plans were in motion for a federal investigation. A task force would be assembled, the evidence would be analyzed, and arrest warrants would be prepared. But first, they had to get Jake, Carol, and David to safety. Mike arranged for them to be placed in protective custody, hidden in a safe house while the investigation proceeded. "How long before arrests start happening?" Jake asked. "Could be weeks, could be months," Mike replied. "An investigation of this scope takes time to do properly. We need to verify the evidence, corroborate witness statements, build cases that will hold up in court." Jake understood, but he also knew that every day they delayed was another day for the conspiracy to regroup and cover their tracks. "They're going to know something is wrong when Carol and David don't show up for their debriefing tomorrow," Jake pointed out. "Let them wonder," Mike said. "Uncertainty and fear are going to be their biggest enemies now. The more paranoid they become, the more likely they are to make mistakes." That night, in the safe house, Jake couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the 43 graves hidden in the forest, about the families who had been grieving for loved ones they believed were dead or missing, not knowing that the truth was so much worse. He thought about Sarah Mitchell, whose passion for environmental protection had cost her life. He thought about all the other victims, people whose only crime had been asking inconvenient questions or threatening the financial interests of the conspiracy. And he thought about his own community, the place where he'd lived his entire life, and how it had been corrupted from within by people who were supposed to be its leaders and protectors. The next morning brought news that Mayor Caldwell had called an emergency town council meeting. According to Mike's sources, panic was spreading through the conspiracy as they realized the extent of their exposure. "They're going to try to destroy evidence and eliminate witnesses," Mike warned. "This is the most dangerous time for everyone involved."
Over the next several days, Jake watched from the safe house as his community began to tear itself apart.
News of the investigation began to leak, despite the federal authorities' attempts to keep it quiet. Rumors spread through the town like wildfire. Some people fled. Mayor Caldwell was among the first to leave, ostensibly for a family emergency that would keep him away indefinitely. Several town council members and city officials also departed suddenly, leaving behind jobs and responsibilities with minimal explanation. Others tried to strike deals with the investigators, offering information in exchange for leniency. The conspiracy, which had been held together for decades by fear and mutual complicity, began to crumble as individual members looked out for their own interests. Jake received regular updates from Mike about the progress of the investigation. The evidence they'd recovered from the forest shelter was proving even more valuable than initially expected. Financial records were leading investigators to bank accounts and shell companies that had been used to launder millions of dollars in stolen funds. The maps showing burial site locations were being used to guide search teams equipped with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. One by one, the hidden graves were being located and excavated. They've recovered 12 bodies so far, Mike reported during one of his visits to the safe house, and they're finding evidence at each site that corroborates the documentation you provided. Jake felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that the truth was finally being revealed, but sadness for the victims and their families who had waited so long for justice. 2 weeks into the investigation, the first arrests were made. Not Mayor Caldwell or any of the other primary conspirators who had fled or disappeared, but several of the lower-level participants who had remained in town. The arrests created even more chaos in the community. Local news stations picked up the story, and soon regional and national media outlets were descending on the small town to cover what was being called one of the largest public corruption cases in state history. Jake watched the news coverage from the safe house, seeing his quiet hometown transformed into a circus of media attention and law enforcement activity. It was surreal to see places he'd known his entire life being treated as crime scenes, to see neighbors and acquaintances being led away in handcuffs. But he also felt a sense of vindication. The truth was finally being told. The victims were finally being acknowledged. Justice was finally being served. 3 months later, Jake was able to return to his community for the first time since that October day when he'd stumbled upon the hidden shelter in the forest. The town had changed dramatically. Many businesses had closed, either because their owners had fled or because the economic disruption caused by the investigation had destroyed the local economy. But there were positive changes too. New leadership had emerged, people who were committed to rebuilding the community on a foundation of honesty and transparency. Support groups had been formed for the families of victims. Memorial services had been held for those whose bodies had been recovered from the forest graves. Jake visited Sarah Mitchell's grave in the town cemetery, where her body had been reburied after being recovered from the forest. Her headstone bore a simple inscription. She asked the right questions. Standing there in the afternoon sunlight, Jake reflected on the events that had transformed his life and his community. The conspiracy had been exposed, many of the perpetrators had been brought to justice, and the systematic murder and corruption that had plagued the town for decades had finally been stopped. But the cost had been enormous. Lives had been lost, families had been destroyed, and an entire community had been forced to confront the horrible truth about what had been happening in their midst. Jake thought about the woman's desperate plea that day in the forest. "Stop! Don't look under there!" He was glad he hadn't listened. Some truths were too important to remain buried, no matter how much pain they might cause when they were finally revealed. The hunter had torn it open and demanded to know who had done this. And in the end, he had gotten his answer.